I would like to get to my guests. I believe this is the first time I've had the opportunity to meet you. Brian, how do I pronounce your last name? Is it Mier?
Yes, correct.
Right. I was aware of you for a very long time, but this is the first time I had the opportunity to meet you. Welcome to the show. How you doing today? You doing all right?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks for having me on. I like your
No,
show.
man, I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And just to give the bio, Brian Mier, he's a journalist, geographer who has lived in Brazil for more than 26 years. He's a co-editor for the independent news website, Brazil Wire, a damn good magazine, by the way. Brazil correspondent for Telesurf English news program from the South. Thank you for this. And both of those really good institutions to be a part of. Um, I have to get your take on something. I just made an argument that I think many of my audience may disagree with, but I want to get your take. Bolsonaro. So the Supreme Court in Brazil recently pointed out that he could stand trial. Now, explain this to me because maybe I'm wrong in my take. My take, people have been pointing out Le Pen, Trump, Colin Gagetscu, basically all of these people who, for whatever particular reason, the legal system has been used to go after them to prevent them from running in the race. They add Bolsonaro to that. And for me, I do not add him to that list, but maybe I'm wrong. What are they charging him with or potentially charging Bolsonaro with?
First of all, it's very important to note that Bolsonaro was barred from running for political office for breaking election laws, abuse of authority by transmitting a nearly 2-hour rant against Brazil's electronic voting system in a meeting with a group of over 100 foreign diplomats while he was president and transmitted it on live national public television. That's an electoral crime. This was like 6 weeks before the election. He didn't provide any evidence. He was barred 2 years ago. So bringing it up now in relation to Marine Le Pen is irrelevant. He can't run anyway, right? People like Glen Greenwald are citing polls, imaginary polls, because he can't be a candidate, which show him ahead of Lula at the moment. For the last 2 years, Lula's been dominating all the polls. What's happened is there was a series of climactic disasters last year that affected a lot of the crops in products like coffee. So like the month that they just did this poll that shows Bolsonaro's ahead of Lula, coffee prices just doubled in Brazil. And everyone's like grumpy because they can't afford the morning coffee because Brazilians drink a huge amount of coffee. You know, so everyone's like, screw Lula. But that's not going to go on for very long. And the case against Bolsonaro now was very carefully laid out. It was almost a 2-year, 3 investigations that were carried out over the course of 2 years. A joint parliamentary investigation, which recommended his indictment, then an over 1-year-long federal police investigation, which produced 884 pages of material evidence against Bolsonaro and like 34 of his cronies. And then they turned it over to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office did a follow-up investigation in which they lowered the number of indicted people to 32. They removed the president of Bolsonaro's Liberal Party from the indictments and produced this 234-page report, which it handed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then read it over, approved it to move forwards. So at this point, they gave all of the defense lawyers time to make out their legal arguments. In one case, Bolsonaro requested that judgment of the evidence, which is the next procedural step, be done by the full plenary session instead of one group of 5 judges. But even one of Bolsonaro's own appointees voted against that. That lost 9-1 in the Supreme Court. So they pushed it back to after they'd heard all the defense arguments, they said, we approve moving forwards. So then the Attorney General's office gave it its stamp of approval, kicked back to the courts, the Supreme Court, and last week they had a process called the formal review of evidence. And all this does is it establishes materiality. Is there enough material evidence to move forwards with a case? And it was a unanimous ruling in the first panel of the Supreme Court, 5-0, to move forward on 5 criminal charges against Bolsonaro. And in this first batch, 7 of his accomplices, including General Augusto Heleno, who many people remember as the head of Minastah's armed forces during the Cite Soleil massacre in Haiti. He is a long-standing, far-right, neo-fascist military general whose roots go back to the military dictatorship. He was the personal aide-de-camp, assistant of a general who tried to hold an auto coup in 1978, who refused, there was a small group of hardliners inside the army that refused to turn the government back over to civilian control, which was underway at that time. And he goes back that far. This is the first time generals have ever been put on trial in Brazil since before the 1964 US-backed military coup. So and the charges are like leading an armed conspiracy to create a democratic rupture with the rule of law, attempted coup d'etat, attempted plotting the assassinations of President Lula, Vice President Geraldo Alckmin, and one of the Supreme Court justices, Alexandre de Moraes, who's being made out by people like Elon Musk, Michael Schellenberger, Glen Greenwald, Tucker Carlson, these types of people, to be this huge boogeyman who's secretly running the government, when in all, he's just one of 11 Supreme Court justices. He's not even the Supreme Court president or chief minister, but he has this kind of like Dr. Evil look to him, so he looks good in names and stuff, So this is a process that's been going on for 2 years. It's not like they just woke up and said, oh, look, they're putting Marine Le Pen on trial. Let's do the same thing in Brazil because we want to join this bandwagon of persecuting, real populist leaders, like Jair Bolsonaro. Yeah, Jair Bolsonaro, who once posted on a neo-Nazi website, you guys are the reasons I came into politics.
No, I appreciate that. Because again, I came, I know it's like, I did not put him on that list. He is a different animal to me. Like the notion, like I remember when Lula, with the car wash, Operation Car Wash, and Bolsonaro threatened one of the judges in it, which ended up being the deciding vote, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that ended up getting Lula put in a cage. And I'm like, okay, am I really going to be sympathetic in this case when you put your political opponent in a cage and you listed all of those sins right off the bat? He will get his day in court and it will be decided at that point. Yeah. From your take on it, though, I mean, Glen Greenwald has been very critical of the Brazilian political system, effectively saying that going after Bolsonaro is effectively ignoring democratic order, that it's somehow a breach of authority.
That ironically, right? Because these guys tried to enact a military coup. That's an actual breach of authority.
Yes. And Glen Greenwald would have been complaining about, oh my God, I can't believe they breached military authority. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on this. From your take, Lula, when I was there, I was covering the Brazilian elections when Lula ran against Bolsonaro. I was shocked, I got to be honest, by some of the takes of people. When Lula first went in left politics, he was at like 80% approval. He was one of the most popular politicians that was around the world, not just in Brazil. This time around, it was very close. It was like 51-48 or something, or 51-49. Why so close? And I got to be honest, many of the people that I was talking to on the ground were for Bolsonaro. One guy even pointed out, we need a dictatorship in Brazil because, we need people to get stuff done. And as I prodded him, it was kind of like, but let's assume for the moment you're right and Lula is corrupt. But he was giving back all of the stuff to the public. If you were getting something from it, why would you be pissed off by it, considering you're not getting anything from the other side? It's like, hey, that's a really good point. It's like, what do you mean that's a good point? You were just asking for a military dictatorship.
Yeah.
Like,
dictatorship
what happened?
There's a couple things that happened, but first of all, when you look at that result of that election, you have to realize that part of the indictment, one of the people who's indicted in this case by the Attorney General's office who's going up against the Supreme Court is former National Highway Police Chief Anderson Torres, who had thousands of highway patrolmen, only in the districts where Lula was polling the highest, harass and stop voters from trying to get to the polling stations on election day. And there's thousands of cases of this. So probably about 1%, 1.2% dip in the vote for Lula was just these hundreds of thousands of people being blocked from voting, kind of like what Jeb Bush did in Florida in 2000 with African American voters. So they went to the Northeast where Lula had the most popularity, and they did that. Bolsonaro also illegally harnessed the power of the state to do things like 1 month and a half before elections. He said, well, I'm going to temporarily, raise welfare payments by 50% until after the elections. He did that in a cynical ploy, thinking that like poor people just voted for Lula because of money handouts or something, right? It's kind of like this Republican or whatever, like libertarian idea. And in that case, it didn't really work that well. Most of the people who voted for Bolsonaro were middle class white men, white Catholic middle class men making over 5 times the minimum wage were his largest demographic. Among poor populations, Lula still carried 70% of the vote or something. So It didn't work that well, but it was illegal. It wasn't a legal ploy. And so that explains some of it. And then there's also this kind of like algorithm manipulation on the social media. We know that all of big tech supports the far right in Brazil. And you see how they create these kind of last minute surges in elections all the time through Instagram and X and all of these other, WhatsApp conversation groups bombarding people with disinformation. That was a major factor in the election as well, and that is the main factor in why such a large percent of the population, 44% right now, believe that Bolsonaro is innocent. Or that not that he's innocent, or that he shouldn't be tried, because there's an amnesty movement going on. Bolsonaro himself has admitted guilt. This is another difference between him and Le Pen. He's not saying I'm innocent anymore. He's saying I want amnesty. I want to be pardoned. So he's trying to get his allies in Congress to pass a law pardoning him for his crimes. He himself is not saying he's innocent. Glen Greenwald is saying he's innocent. Bolsonaro himself doesn't say he's innocent. He admits it. He admits he was at the meeting when they were planning to assassinate Lula, and he's just like, "Well, that was just talk. That's not a crime talking about it." And it is, but it is a crime. So there's just a massive amount of disinformation through the social media. People are being heavily manipulated by algorithms
please continue. I'm sorry.
No, into like making electoral decisions that will harm them. I'm not saying Lula's doing a fantastic job or anything. He's got problems. The government's got a lot of problems, and one of it's because he can't get his mandate strong enough because of this constant bombardment of disinformation, right? One thing he's trying to do is relieve 90% of Brazil's workers from having to pay income tax. And so the libertarians on the far right are opposed to this because it includes raising the tax on the super rich.
Oh.
So like the anti-tax people are like opposed to this, and they're putting all this, they're bombarding the public with all this disinformation that this would be bad for the 90% of the population that won't have to pay income tax anymore. Every attempt he does to try and put taxes on the super wealthy and on large fortunes, things like that, there's this massive anti-Lula publicity campaign with lies. Like they had a lying campaign. There's a kind of electronic transaction called Pigs here, where you use your phone or whatever, you scan a QR code, and they announced they were going to start taxing all transactions over like $50,000 on it. And the far right immediately put out thousands of different videos and memes and things like that, announcing that the government was going to tax every transaction for like $1 or something. And so large percentages of the population believe this crap. This is like a worldwide phenomenon. It's happening everywhere.
And voted against their own interests.
Yeah, well.
Wow. I mean, what is the makeup of the parliament or Congress in Brazil?
The Workers' Party has 14%. Lula's Workers' Party has 14% of Congress. And together with some inner allies, about 18% of Congress. Even so, they've still managed to push through a lot of things through this broader coalition with this, what they call the center right, but some of Brazil's center right is actually really far right. Some of it would support, like, still talks positively about the dictatorship. Some of the center right, but he's built a coalition with the center right by handing out ministries to different people, which kind of cripples the ability to run a left-wing government when you've got conservatives in different ministries, right? Important ministries. But through that, he's managed to hold on to like a slim majority in Congress. But this is it's like a Chuck Schumer style majority in which like they'll vote for him for their PT's measures on some key issues of policy. But when you get into the economics, all of a sudden some of these people start jumping.
Yeah, they drop off.
Yeah, dropping off. So he's having a tough time with it, really, just
well, I assume he was going to have a tough go with it. I mean, like I said, when I saw that people were hanging out at the military station begging for them to overthrow the government, and it's like, whoa, what is happening right now? Like, that is amazing to me. Like, the dictatorship itself, why is part of the population enamored with the dictatorship?
Well, I've been living in Brazil 30 years now. The bio information you gave for me is like a little outdated, but ever since I've moved to Brazil, I first moved to Brazil in 91. Ever since I've moved to Brazil, 20% of the people I ever talk to speak fondly of the dictatorship and some fascist ideals. And then a larger percentage of the middle class supports a lot of fascist ideals, like killing drug dealers, summary execution of drug dealers, mostly black people, right? Obviously in the favelas and stuff like that. Like they're killing teenagers and stuff like that. Super violent police force has the support of most of Brazil's like white middle class, even if they pretend to be progressive and liberal and stuff like that. So there's always been a core element of fascism in Brazil, back to the 1930s when Brazil had the largest Nazi party outside of Germany, outside of Europe. And it had an indigenous fascist movement called the Integralists, who wore green armbands with a Greek letter E on them. A bunch of weirdos. They influenced the dictatorship. And Bolsonaro has sympathy with a lot of those integralist principles, which he's talked about through his political career. I think social media was used systematically under guidance of Steve Bannon, which we know he's very close to Eduardo Bolsonaro and some of Bolsonaro's other children. Dating back to like 2017, they started systematically blowing up sympathy for a lot of like fascist principles and ideals at the same time that the Koch apparatus, the Koch brothers started Koch or whatever. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing
Koch
the way
brothers.
I truly feel about them.
The Koch brothers. Yeah, the Koch brothers.
But they started in 2013 financing all of these student libertarian groups, creating groups like Students for Liberty. So they bombarded the population with this kind of like, it's really like the first time libertarianism ever arrived in Brazil, honestly. So it was like a merger of these groups that were pushing this libertarianism with this fascist idealism, At the same time, elements of the far right started this Ukrainize Brazil campaign through connections with Azov. This is like 2013, 2014.
Wow.
And so these forces kind of like converged, but massive propaganda coming from outside of Brazil on the social media networks, paid for by business elites, who benefit from business elites always benefit from fascist style policies and stuff like that, because it's a smoke and mirror game. You take all the blame off of the rich and put it on some scapegoated group. In Brazil would be the communists, who are everybody who's left of center. Bolsonaro called The Economist magazine the e-communist once. The Economist is like a bastion of right-wing economics for 180 years. uh,
Communists.
yeah, but it's just dumb. Yeah, well, Trump does the same stuff. He calls. I mean, I wish Joe Biden was an actual communist. You know, it's too late now. But I mean, calling the Democrats communists is pretty.
Oh, it's absurd. They get nothing done. They're absolutely pathetic. They're in fact, they're in shambles at this point. They're completely irrelevant. They're not even a political opposition to Trump at this point.
Sadly.
I'm curious on something else. BRICS. In what effect has BRICS had on Brazil in and of itself? I mean, they're expanding, obviously, and they clearly have a certain percentage of the wealth in regards to like more than the G7 at this point. How have you seen the effect on the ground in Brazil?
Yeah, definitely. Because look, when BRICS started, the U.S. was Brazil's largest trade partner. You know, now Brazil's trading with China at a 3-to-1 ratio compared to the United States. The U.S. is a distant second in importance in trade. Very different from the situation faced by Mexico right now, right? In a very different situation. In fact, under Bolsonaro, who Tucker Carlson presented in this ridiculous documentary, election season documentary, as this bastion, this wall that would stand between China and Brazil. You know, trade with China increased dramatically under Bolsonaro. In fact, when he auctioned off, the only times he auctioned off oil fields belonging to the state petroleum company, Petrobras, which the U.S. has been dreaming of dismantling since the 1950s, the only offshore auction he held, it was the oil fields were entirely bought up by Chinese companies. You know, so Bolsonaro was selling off Brazilian assets to the Chinese. He tried to privatize the national electric grid, and there was a Chinese company that was going to buy it. And so there's nothing, he didn't really do anything to stop trade with China. He just used a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric and racist. One of his ministers had to retire because he was making racist caricatures of Chinese people on his social media and stuff like that. And then he visited China. He visited China and said, "Oh, this isn't communist, you know. It's those people in Brazil, they're the communists. This isn't communist."
So he is being racist to China while selling off items of the country to China.
But then, you know, you can see that China respects the Workers' Party much, much more than it did the Bolsonaro government. That stuff of growing trade under Bolsonaro was just trade. In the case of the PT, you saw Lula had this massive red carpet treatment with a full band and everything when he made his trip there. Dilma Rousseff is really respected as bank president, new development bank president. She was just reelected, I think almost unanimously. Everybody's really happy with her at the new development bank. She's going to be in charge for another 5 years, regardless of what happens in the 2026 elections. Some people say that well, there's a lot of criticism you could make about BRICS. I mean, some people were trying to act like BRICS was going to be this new military bloc, and it doesn't seem like there's any evidence. Oh, the BRICS are going to save everybody in the world from the United States, from NATO, and stuff like that. I don't think. I mean, you look at their reaction to Gaza right now, for example. I don't see very much promising hope coming out of the BRICS on that issue, really. But
economic bloc. I didn't think it was a military organization.
No, but some of these edgelords, you know, I'm just saying, some of these like Eurasia edgelords on the internet and stuff were acting like a year ago as if BRICS was going to be this military force, you know, when Iran joined. But economically, yeah, I think that I have a feeling that like China can't just pull the rug out under the U.S. economy, because it's, in a way, it's like too big to fail almost. So what they have to do is kind of like chip away at it. What other countries around the world have to do to weaken the US's nefarious imperialist influence, which is driving up poverty and sadness all over the world, is to chip away at it. And so these new increasing transactions between BRICS nations using their local currencies, I think, is very positive. You know, I don't think there's going to be a new BRICS currency in the immediate future, but it would be great if it happened at some point.
Yeah. Why did Lula, or let's say Brazil, veto Venezuela's entry into BRICS?
Look, I was in Venezuela I covered the elections for Telesur in July, and a lot of people are really bummed out, pissed off at Lula. From what I understand, they got into this personal beef. It started getting really personal between Maduro and Lula. And, for example, Lula, first of all, Brazil tried to project itself as this non-aligned, kind of like impartial force around the world when Lula took office, which is what it's a historical fact of Brazilian foreign relations, right? So, like, by going and saying and taking a neutral position with China in the war in Ukraine, they condemned the occupation, military occupation, but they also condemned Zelensky. They refused to arm Zelensky. They're doing this tightrope walk, and they started doing it in Venezuela. And at first, it was a coalition of Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil moderating the elections. Now, there's a problem that the Maduro administration never released the ballot information, right? So that's a problem. They allege that they were hacked, which I believe by Elon Musk's information. I mean, our network went down on election night. We were hacked. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure they were hacked, but you can't hack individual ballots. There was a massive surge in WhatsApp and other social media activity with anti-Maduro disinformation and propaganda during the week before the election and subsequent coup d'etat attempt, which happened the day after the election. I think, and when they started going back, at first Brazil said they supported the election results and that they would just wait for the ballot information to make an official statement on it. The ballot information never came. The Workers' Party, a week later, issued an official statement recognizing the election results. So the Lula government broke from the Workers' Party on this, his own party. And during this back and forth of escalating insults between Maduro and Lula, Maduro supported Jair Bolsonaro's theory about the elections being stolen in 2022. What? Yeah. And Lula blew his top.
I can imagine. It's an attack on his legitimacy.
But he was kind of attacking Maduro's legitimacy too.
Yeah, true.
And these two countries need each other right now. And I think it was an error to veto Venezuela's entrance in the BRICS. I think it was dumb. And that doesn't mean I don't support the Lula administration. Everyone does things you do. Lula always manages to piss off everybody with one or two things while he's president. But the whole the whole group of things he does is enough for people to support him and like him. That was one of the low points. I think one of the low points, if not that's the foreign policy low point of the Lula administration. That, and also having the ambassador kicked out of Managua, which is BS.
Oh, wait, I don't know that one. The ambassador for who? Oh, for a Venezuelan ambassador kicked out of Managua.
No, Brazilian ambassador was kicked out of Managua. This is another thing. The ambassadors, a lot of them are super right wing. I mean, this was an ambassador who was appointed by Bolsonaro, who was anti-Nicaragua, but he was kicked out of Nicaragua. The Pope asked Lula to try and see if he could get some of these Catholics who were arrested for their role in the coup attempt in Nicaragua out of jail. I mean, some of these Catholic priests were stockpiling automatic weapons. When they were arrested, they had like hundreds of automatic weapons. I mean, Lula remembers the dictatorship. there's two groups in the Catholic Church. There's the liberation theology people in Latin America who have been shrinking over the years, and there's these fascist Catholics. I mean, he knows there's fascist Catholics. There's a lot of these fascist bishops supported Bolsonaro. So I don't know why he would get involved in that, but he's super Catholic, and it's like the Pope asked him. He's probably like, I don't want to go to hell.
Two more stories. I guess one of my viewers wanted me to bring up this. Marco Rubio goes to Jamaica and trashes Cuban doctors. Just completely trashes Cuban doctors. This is pretty amazing considering Cuban doctors have gone all around the world providing healthcare. Cuba dumps a bunch of money into education and medicine, and that is a benefit to the rest of the world. Rubio apparently doesn't think so. This is him.
This is not about the provision of medical assistance. We have no problem with medical assistance. We have no problem with doctors. But I'm just talking about this program in general, how it's operated around the world. And how it's operated around the world is that basically the doctors are not paid. They basically operate as forced labor.
Let us be clear. The Cuban doctors in Jamaica have been incredibly helpful to us. Jamaica has a deficit in health personnel, primarily because many of our health personnel have migrated to other countries. We are, however, very careful not to exploit the Cuban doctors who are here. We ensure that they are treated within our labor laws and benefit like any other worker. So any characterization of the program by others certainly would not be applicable to Jamaica. We are ensuring that our program complies with all the international laws and standards to which we are a party to.
This is not about the provision of medical assistance. We have no problem with medical assistance. We have no problem with doctors. I'm just talking.
So.
He cares about human rights. Ooh, it's the human rights we're worried about. Look, as ICE is doing everything, we're worried about human rights in Latin America and the Caribbean. Seriously? You're arresting children who are U.S. citizens, pulling them out of schools right now, accidentally arresting U.S. citizens. So I don't think you really care about human rights.
Yeah, I don't think they care about human rights all that much either. And, the notion that he's attacking effectively doctors and the use of those doctors is just outrageous, just completely outrageous.
The international far right is all connected to each other. And this was one of the issues that was used to drum up support for the impeachment, which was a parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff. There was no crime committed. She was just impeached arbitrarily. And one of the things was this, because she brought in 18,000 Cuban doctors. And the media tries to say, they're slaves. They're doing slave labor for Cuba because, the way the system works is that they receive a salary from the government of the country they go to. And Cuba establishes what a comfortable middle class salary would be out of that big salary. And the rest of the money is kicked back to their medical programs so they can keep sending doctors to other parts of the world that don't have money to pay their doctors. And all of the doctors who enter this program know that they're not going to get, for example, in Brazil, doctors in the public system we're getting 13 or 14,000 reais a month. At the time, this was $6,000 a month or something. And so the Cubans made a deal with the Brazilian government that they would receive $1,800 a month, which in Brazil would be making about $6,000 or $7,000 a month, money-wise, plus their housing is paid for, and the rest of the money kicks back to the program. This is what the Rubio and the State Department are trying to pretend is some kind of slavery system. Which is,
That's outrageous. That's so outrageous. That is, they are a national good. They're a national good. And I'm glad that that gentleman came out and pointed out they are a national good. This is not, Rubio's take on this is just outrageous. One last thing.
Just add one quick thing. Everyone in Brazil who uses the public health system, me included, is always super happy when they find out the doctors that's going to attend them is Cuban. The Cuban doctors have a reputation of being much better than the Brazilian doctors because they listen to the patients.
Really?
Brazilian doctors are elites who don't listen to poor people or working class people when they're trying to tell them their problems. Half the time they're talking on the phone. The Cuban doctors listen to people. They treat the situation homeopathically. They're used to cheap solutions for health issues. They ask people like, what have you been eating? Well, do you get any exercise? All this kind of stuff that when you go into a Brazilian public health doctor, normally they just look at you and they give a prescription. Say, all right, there, take antibiotics.
That's outrageous. Wow, that is amazing. Yeah, that is amazing. One last thing. There is a story, and I should have hit you with the story, but I saw the story this morning. It came out by Ryan Grimm, and it has to do with El Salvador. Do you know? Okay, so Donald Trump has been deporting people to El Salvador who are Venezuelan, effectively taking people who are Venezuelan who without due process, meaning we don't know if they're innocent or guilty. Most likely they're innocent, mixing them up with gang members, and then sending them to El Salvador. Come to find out that Bukele apparently had a relationship, or that relationship is the wrong word. What Bukele apparently was doing behind the scenes, according to the story, was working with the gangs and having conversations and negotiations with high-level gang members in order to, we will give you political favors, we may give you resources and money, we may give you legal cover, etc. We're going to help you be the most powerful gang. We're going to work with you. We need you to cut down the killings, and we need you to support us politically and other people around us politically, so we can be the strongest political party, have a supermajority, and we can run out on stage and say, "Hey, crime is down. We've done fantastic work. Am I not awesome?" And it was one of the gentlemen that was deported that apparently was the link that Bukele wanted to get his hands on in order to make sure that he doesn't testify in court that effectively this relationship was taking place. Do you know anything about this? I mean, this is in the weeds. I didn't ask you about this in advance.
No, but I will say this. This is how a lot of city governments have worked in just about every city I've ever lived in my life, including Chicago, where I grew up during the Daley times. They had to fire a couple police chiefs because of involvement with the gangs and the partnerships with the gangs and the mafia and things like that. And this is common in Brazil. The police in Rio de Janeiro, when I was living there, they would rent out their armored vehicles to one gang so they could invade the territory of another gang. And so it just seems like business as usual. And obviously, one of the best ways to lower crime in a city with a lot of gangs is make a deal with the gangs. I mean, if you look at Sao Paulo in Brazil, Sao Paulo has one of the lowest murder rates in the world of any big city. I mean, it's almost like a European level murder rate. And it's because one gang consolidated all of the favelas in the whole city and a lot of the other areas. And they made a deal with the state government that controls the police. It's just like, you don't make any problems, we won't make any problems. Let us arrest some people every once in a while just to show that we're doing our jobs, obviously, and things will continue as normal. And I think that's it. I'm not surprised that Bukele's done that, and that's part of his secret of lowering the crime rate in El Salvador.
That is amazing. So effectively, we'll let you do your crime, providing you don't get beyond a certain point. You may support
and don't kill a lot of people, right? Like, right.
Don't kill a lot of people.
Drugs. Yeah. Don't do anything to draw attention to yourselves.
We don't like a lot of murders, so don't do that.
Yeah.
But we can negotiate. We can talk. We can have this open dialogue in regards to the way we deal with it. That is amazing. That is not the way Bukele presents himself. He presents himself as, I am super hard on these gangs. Look at what I'm doing to these gang members. I crush, testicles. You can send your gang members to me. That's the image that he portrays. Not, I'm working behind the scenes to negotiate to get political favors from murderous gangs in order to keep down the killings. Like, that is astonishing. And apparently, the guy who Trump deported was the guy that Bukele wanted because he didn't want the guy to testify in court.
He's a witness, so that guy's going to be killed maybe or something, right? You think? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. I mean, at this point, he's in El Salvador.
Yeah.
He's been deported. So we have no idea what happens from here on out. He's out of U.S. custody.
It's just outrageous that in a context like this, Marco Rubio would be in Jamaica, like sternly lecturing Jamaica about its human rights by hiring Cuban doctors, you know?
Oh man, that is so insane. Yeah, that is so
insane. They're about to invade Greenland and Panama, you know, and they're like, oh, there's doctors, they're only making like 40% of what we think they should be making. That's slavery.
They're insane. This administration has been just completely nuts. Brian, man, I have appreciated this big time. I hope I haven't been too much of a pest. I appreciated your rundown of it. Like I said, I was in Brazil during the election. I was fascinated. Like it was things that people were saying was catching me off guard. Only because, for my take, it was kind of like, okay, well, Lula had like an 80% approval rating. How are you guys hating on this guy? Now, at the point where he won, people were running through the streets, driving through the streets, beeping horns and everything else. Many of them were excited. But there was a clear split in the society. And I was like,
English speakers are elites in Brazil. Anyone who speaks English is almost always going to be middle class and conservative. So if you don't speak Portuguese, you get a very skewed idea about what politics is like in Brazil. And this causes problems for a lot of journalists, you know, when they first come down and stuff. And also there's big regional differences. Like in my state where I live, Pernambuco, Lula won with almost 70% of the vote. Whereas in the southeast, like Rio and Sao Paulo, he just squeaked by. You know?
I think I was in Sao Paulo when I was covering. No, I was in Rio de Janeiro when I was covering.
Yeah. Well, Rio is the bastion of Bolsonarism. And it's the first state in Brazil that became majority population neo-Pentecostal Christian. And so Rio, despite its image of being this, you know, party city and everything like that, it's actually very conservative outside of a few neighborhoods. You know, it's where Bolsonaro comes from. It's his political base. So he's beloved in large sections of Rio.
That explains it. The food is fantastic. Oh God, the food is fantastic. Brian, where can people find you before I let you go?
Well, I have a Substack. Brazil Wire is in kind of like on a hiatus. We don't really publish much there anymore. So I have a Substack account called D Lincoln Brazil with a hyphen, D-Lincoln. And Telesur, you know, Telesur and Telesur English, Twitter, X, Blue Sky, that kind of stuff. I write for Counter, Punch, and Fair sometimes.
Yeah. All fantastic outlets. Telesur, especially. Thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. You be safe.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good one.